Thank you, and very pleased to be here today and to talk about this work that I did together with Kunde Konig, who is in the room here today, and Carla Barisone from the European University Institute. I'm going to speak about the rise of environmental impact reporting in food systems. I'm going to focus on carbon footprint monitoring, and indeed, I would like you and the audience to retain the terms fast and furious from this presentation. Because we, after having worked on this theme for a few months, have the impression that this world of carbon footprint reporting is moving in a fast and furious way. So we at the OECD had to move fast and furiously to catch up with an area that is relatively new for us. And on my last slide, I will say that you, as agricultural economists, may want to consider also moving fast and furiously into this area of work, and I will show you in that last slide why. But I will spend the first 29 slides on explaining why we have the impression that this area is moving so rapidly. Most of you will know, all of you know, that food systems exert an important pressure on the environment. This is because of the land use of our food systems. Agriculture is often associated to deforestation. It's associated to biodiversity loss. The water use of agricultural systems is heavy, sometimes contributing to water pollution, and this is the important part of my presentation here, it is estimated that around 1/3 of man-made greenhouse gas emissions are stemming from food systems. That's a lot, and that's why the world is looking at what food systems will be doing in terms of addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's why the concern you expressed, and which is a real concern, that in the agricultural sector and food systems there is a history of not moving rapidly, that is of course of concern. Now, most of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, on climate change from food systems comes through land use change and agricultural production. If you try to sum up the different sources of impact on greenhouse gas emissions, so land use, agricultural production itself, processing, transport, packaging, retail, cooking, waste, if you sum this all up, you see that really most of the source of greenhouse gas emission is at the left, is at the beginning, is in the change of land use in order to change land used in a different way, for a natural way, for the use of agricultural production itself, and together these two areas actually are responsible for 70% of total food systems emissions that contribute to the greenhouse gas situation that we are familiar with. Now, the contribution to greenhouse gas emission differs a lot by product. It also differs by producers. Here you see some information on the differences across products. Most of us by now have heard that eating fruits or vegetables contributes less to greenhouse gas emissions than eating meat or dairy products. And you see this quite nicely here in this chart. So if you look at where the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions comes from, that comes from bovine meat, from lamb and mutton, but also from cheese, and unfortunately for me, from chocolate, because I like to eat chocolate. What is also interesting on this chart is that the source of the greenhouse gas emissions differ. So if you look at meat production, the source is very much from the agricultural activity itself, relatively larger. When you look at bovine meat, is the green side of the bar. That's what happens on the far. It's larger than the blue bar. That's the land use change impact for the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if you go to chocolate, dark chocolate, there you see that the blue bar is bigger than the green bar. So that greenhouse gas emission of chocolate production come mainly from land use change. Important differences also across producers. And first, if you look at this chart, I want you to think about what kind of data are needed to draw a chart like this. Here we have information on the global median carbon footprint of bovine meat producers. So that's the white dot is median. How much does do 50%, a 50% producer of bovine meat, how big are the greenhouse gas emissions? And what you see on this chart is that the range, the gray zone is the range between the 10% best producers and the 10% most polluting producers. That range is huge, in particular in bovine meat production. So a lot can be done by inciting producers, those who produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in their production, to become a bit better and a bit more efficient. So after what I've just told you, we can conclude that there are 3 levers to achieve a lower impact in food systems in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And remember, food systems are responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. So it would be interesting to use all these levers. We could shift to lower impact product categories. So let's eat more fruits and vegetables compared to meat. We could shift to lower impact producers within each category. So how to buy, for instance, dairy products from more effective producers, those who produce less greenhouse gas emissions. And for this, we should need somehow to inform consumers about who are the good producers. And we could try to work more on technologies, and here we are at R&D that Tom also spoke about, trying to influence the generation of technologies and the use of those technologies in order to shift production more generally into more carbon-friendly production. So on the chart that I showed you before, this would mean the 3 levers would mean move from more consumption for more meat, dairy product consumption, to more consumption of fruits and vegetables, move the bars, the producers, from the right to the left, have them become less polluting, or move all the bars from the right to the left, introduce technologies that are generally better for the environment. So how can we do this? How can we set incentives for consumers, for producers, for R&D systems, to move in these good directions? How can we set these incentives, and how can we monitor that we are actually moving in the right direction? Because that's what we are increasingly requested to do. Now, one of the challenges that we have in order to set these incentives and in order to move in the right direction is that we need to be able to measure what is happening, and we need to be able to measure whether there is change and whether that change is going in the right direction. Ideally, we would like to understand how much greenhouse gas emissions happen at the product level, but along the entire life cycle. So here you see, I think this is a glass of fruits, so you wouldn't only need to see how much greenhouse gas emissions we have when the fruit is produced. This is what you saw in my bars, but we would also need to see how much is produced in terms of greenhouse gases when the fruit is put in this jar, when it is brought to the shop, and when it is bought by this consumer. We would ideally like to help producers to become more effective, so we would like to set incentives to farmers, but also to non-farmers, to produce in a way that is more carbon friendly. So here we would need to have information at the farm level, product level, farm level, and at different stages of production, not only farm, but also the transporters, the retailers, etc., etc. And if we would like to start to use new techniques, new production techniques, new technologies, we would need to understand whether these techniques, these technologies, these new approaches we're going to use, whether at the project level they are actually changing something. So here we would need data at the project level. So altogether, we need a very complex system of impact reporting in food systems in order to make this work. And a particularly big challenge in the food systems area is that there are so many small producers. So when we're talking, for instance, about these kind of systems in the area of steel, we are dealing with much fewer companies, much fewer actors, and much bigger actors. Here, we would ideally need a system that reaches out to many smallholders and small farmers, and not only in Europe, also in Africa. Now, you could say this is this system of data collection, of assessment, that's something that is science fiction. And I must admit here that that's what we thought at the OECD before we started to work on this paper for this conference. So I thank the organizers for inviting us and for having inspired us to work on this. We were looking at this carbon footprint reporting as something theoretical. We were thinking about models. We were thinking about this is something that will happen in 10, 20 years from now, and it's something we have to start understanding. We were discussing, indeed, we were thinking this is something that's very expensive, and you may think the same, it's too expensive to do this. There are too many farms to make this practical. It is actually not that clear what to measure and how to do this, because I use the term greenhouse gas emissions, but we are thinking about different gases. For instance, when I talk about dairy, I'm talking about methane. That's rather specific to that particular sector. So how are we going to measure this? And then the big question, and that's a real question for many businesses, I will come back to that later, but the big question is how are you going to measure this at different parts of the supply chain and then transmit the information along the supply chain, potentially crossing borders. So there's data having to cross borders here. And then, are we even sure that there is demand for this information? So is this really something that is relevant? Is it something that is important? We say, yes, it's important, and we have discovered it's not science fiction, it's not something that will happen in 20 or 30 years from here. It's going on, it's happening, it's moving very rapidly, but the speed can potentially also create new problems, and I will come back to that later. Why is there something that we are now calling the great acceleration? Why is this happening? Well, there is actually demand for this information. It's coming from consumers, from governments, from civil society, and very important, from investors. I will say more about this. It's coming from the supply side. It's actually becoming easier to do these very complicated things because the technologies, the IT side, the data collection, the data analysis part of things have become more easier, less costly, and therefore makes these things possible. There are calculation tools, increasingly data are available. Platforms are being created that allow us to share data across firms, across companies, across borders. There are more technological solutions, and there is an increasing evolution of reporting standards, and I will come back to this. And then there's some broader trends. The supply chain thinking is something that is really evolving. There's a push for more transparency and traceability in general, and there is a growing focus in agriculture, but that's a general trend, also on actually measuring outcomes. How successful is something? Not about changing practices, only do something in a different way. We want to measure whether there's real impact. Let me give information, give more detail on each of these aspects. First, on the demand side. In a study conducted in 2023, consumers were asked whether they are interested in carbon footprint labeling on food items. And here's the answer. Yes. The overwhelming majority of consumers in a range of European countries said, yes, we are interested in more information on carbon footprint. Personally, I find interesting the north-south divide here, so the interest is quite high in Scandinavia, but it reaches nearly 90% in Southern Europe, Italy, Romania, Turkey. So yes, consumers want information on carbon footprint. Carbon footprint labels are actually proliferating. Here are a few examples of information appearing on individual products, either with explicit numbers on how much CO2 is there per volume or per weight, or ratings being used. Are you in the green zone or in the red zone? Another phenomenon that is typical for the agricultural field is that we have labels that cover multiple aspects of environmental performance, not only CO2. For instance, that's the case for the EcoScore label in France or the Foundation Earth label in the UK. So for instance, in the latter, that the ranking there, the coloring between green and red, it doesn't only capture CO2, but also captures water usage and water pollution. One of the studies we are currently conducting at the OECD is to understand whether these multiple aspects of environmental performance in the label, whether it has a different impact on consumer behavior than if you give information information separately on each environmental aspect. But that's something typical for the agricultural field. We are seeing labels that capture multiple aspects of environmental behavior. Very important, as I said this already, investors are demanding greater information. FAIR is an initiative that brings together financial actors that together are responsible for around $70 trillion in investment. And this FAIR initiative is working with the dairy sector in order to induce them to provide more transparency on their ecological performance, in particular on their CO2 footprint. Now, there may be real environmental concerns that are driving this on the investor side, but what is probably the case that financial incentives play a role here too. Those investors are expecting that in the near future, governments will introduce new policies regarding the expectations of dairy farmers when it comes to their carbon footprint. And if governments are going to do that, then the producers that have a bad performance, they represent a financial risk for investors. And hence, for a pure financial reason, if as an investor you expect that producers will in the future be expected to show that they are good performers in terms of carbon footprint, you will start looking into this now, and you will start now, today you're investing in that producer, you will start asking them to inform you about what they are doing in terms of carbon footprint. So this financial incentive from the financial sector is very important, and I think that most of you will recognize the names of the financial players that you are seeing here. So we are seeing more and more disclosure from companies on their carbon footprint, an increasing reference to the climate behavior. Here you see reporting on 3 different aspects: climate, water, and forest behavior via the CDP platform. And I would like you to look at that steep increase, that fast and furious increase in terms of climate reporting that you see on the red line here. So in the last 2 years, a very large number of firms started to conduct regular carbon footprint reporting. By now, we are at 18,000 plus firms, and these are big firms that together represent around 2/3 of international stock markets. So this is important. And these firms work with a lot of suppliers across the globe. Here, however, this figure is not for agri-food firms alone, this is general, right? This is the entire economy. Because unfortunately, and here I go back to Joe's point, it is the case that the agri-food companies are a bit behind. Here is the rating of the quality of information provided by agri-food producers on the CDP platform, and here you see that there is a majority of grading in the gray side, where the reporting information only receives the grade F, and very few are on the green side, reporting high quality of data on the environmental performance. So here more can be done. We think, however, that there is growing pressure on companies to move in this direction. And why is this the case? Because through the COP, through the UNFCCC process, there's an increased pressure for firms to report on their Scope 3 emissions in addition to Scope 1 and Scope 2. Now, the real reason of this paper is the word Scope 3. The word Scope 3 that I discovered when I attended for the first time in my career the COP conference in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. And I was sitting at a dinner with multiple companies that were all exchanging about their efforts to start doing Scope 3 reporting. And I had to realize that I didn't even know what this was. Scope 3 reporting is Scope 1, I report how many greenhouse gas emissions I conduct in my own way of producing. Scope 2, I also include the use of my energy into this. And Scope 3, I use also in my calculation upstream and downstream of my supply chain. This means that if I'm a retailer selling food, I would need to report on every farmer's carbon footprint, a farmer who has contributed something into the food that I'm selling. That's complex. That's very demanding. But this is the demand that is coming from the UNFCCC, from the COP process. And major retailers are taking this seriously. Here you see a whole list of retailers. Carrefour, well known in this country, Aldi, my home country, Germany, all of them now have some kind of commitment to work to do more on Scope 3 reporting. Either, like in the case of Migros from Switzerland, to expect suppliers to provide evidence, so you expect numbers to be given, or they set actually a target of how much their own carbon footprint is going to be. That's the case for Tesco or Carrefour, for instance. Now, if the retailer does this, then the farmer, the producer at the beginning has to start collecting information on this aspect. Public policy goes more and more in this direction. The United States and the EU, they're all starting to request information that is related to Scope 3 reporting. And an interesting example I find, Mexico, Colombia, and Costa Rica, they created an Environmental Alliance of the Americas to promote environmental impact labels, and the important word mutual recognition. So these countries have also realized that it's important that these systems talk to each other. If not, you get into big trouble. Now, we have a situation therefore, that is moving rapidly. You saw this steep increase where suddenly within 2 years, whoop, the number of big companies starting to do Scope 3 reporting, starting to do reporting is increasing. And around this, there are increasingly standards and guidelines that give information on how to do this. Now, it's a complex world, and this complexity is one of the challenges. You can imagine this complex world as being a world that moves from more general standardizations, methods of doing this, to more specific, from firm-level reporting to product-level reporting. Now, at this lower level, you have a number of organizations that provide guidance on how to do environmental behavior reporting. So you have, for instance, the ISO life cycle assessment, but you also have the IFRS standard that is a standard coming from the financial sector. Here you see already the complexity. We get environmental standards from the financial sector, environmental standards from the real economy, from ISO. Do these things speak to each other? Because the people setting these standards typically do not speak to each other. They come from different worlds. You can then go more into the direction of greenhouse gas emission reporting. We have there two very important actors, ISO and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Both have firm-level standards and product-level standards. PACT is an important player. I'll come back to this because they try to help these important different standards and these different reporting methodologies to talk to each other. Here, I've so far been speaking about reporting, environmental reporting across sectors, and then we have standards that are very specific for agriculture or food. For instance, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has guidance for reporting in the agricultural sector. The FAO works in this direction. Or we have subsector standards. Dairy, for instance, in the United States. Now, a lot of standards start to evolve. A lot of companies are using different standards, then different tools, platforms to report on this. The one big question is, what data are they actually reporting? Now, one important thing that we should be aware of is that we have very few direct data. We often estimate the emissions. So for instance, here an example of how this works under the Farm ES tool of the US. And now this is important because that's a US tool. If I have a European tool that doesn't use the same estimates, then we could say they end up not being comparable. And then how do you trade between the European Union and the United States? So this tool asks a dairy producer about information about amount of milk that is produced, information about herd size, average number of calves, so it goes into quite some detail, information about how the animals are fed, and information about manure management. And you put all this information together, and then you can come up with a calculation for the individual dairy producer. What is my dairy producer footprint? How do I compare to the regional average? How do I compare to the national average? And in this case, the poor dairy producer would potentially find it harder to sell to some of these retailers that I've just mentioned, or to get funding from the investors, because this dairy producer does not have a great performance. There are different tools, the Cool Farm tool or the Comet Farm tool. And in some countries, some of these tools have been quite successful in upscaling the use of measuring the farm-level carbon footprint in a particular country. So here you see that it is actually possible, and this is Ireland, to bring many farms, including small farms, on board. 55,000 farms are already using this Origin Green tool in Ireland. What probably makes a difference, that the issue is, in a case like this, does the market lead to a situation where one tool ends up being dominant and therefore covers most of the market, or is there support by a national public actor to use one specific tool? Because if you have multiple tools being used, then you get in trouble. And I've been speaking to senior officials in ministries of our membership who told me that their farmers in their country are confused because there are different providers running around with different tools. So this is one of the challenging aspects. Increasingly, there's also scientific evidence that is available that allows you to estimate numbers if you cannot measure directly. So here a number of scientific articles that have been quite influential in this sphere, but here again it's important to move towards the use of the same material. We start to have global databases that try to put together data from different sources in order for this to start to become comparable. So here the Global Feed LCA Institute that works mainly, I think, on dairy products, so on a particular type of products. And here we have another example, a database of France, the Agri-Balise, that collects information of 2,500 food products using a life cycle assessment. So we start to get platforms that put together different types of data, important data sets that can also be used by researchers. Now, all this so far I told you that we estimate actual carbon footprint performance. We start to have more and more sophisticated information in order to generate these estimates, but we also see now, oh sorry, I forgot this one, very important. Here, this initiative that I mentioned before, it's also becoming easier now to share information along the supply chain. It is PACT, Partnership for Carbon Transparency. So this is a partnership where companies, big players, you see the names here, came together to agree on which tool they use in order to share data along the supply chain. As I mentioned before, if you have a tool, just a technological tool that doesn't speak to the tool of your supplier or the tool of another partner, then you end up having just technical solutions that do not speak to each other. We are now also in a situation where there are increasingly attempts to measure performance directly. So here we see the use of satellite data in order to assess the planet warming emissions from cow burps. So that's apparently possible. But that's interesting. It's maybe not a precise measure either, but you can then compare the satellite information with the estimates that you have produced, and that gives you also a sense then of whether the estimates that you have been producing for a certain region is realistic. It's a method we have applied for other work at the OECD. So compare measurements. In that case, it was for subsidies for industrial activity. We would compare those estimates with satellite pictures to see how much industrial activity is actually taking place in a particular region. So here, new methods that can be used. Now, I've been explaining to you what is happening, and we have the impression that a lot is happening. And it's a lot, and that lot is developing in a fast and furious way. And here you see these different initiatives, standards, that have been arising in different parts of the world, focusing on different parts of the supply chain, on different parts of the agri-food supply chain, coming from the financial sector, coming from the real sector. A lot is going on. Increasingly, we try to have efforts for these things to speak to each other, but this is a picture that nevertheless looks crowded and potentially confusing. And this is why one of the important questions we have to ask ourselves, is there risk that with these best of intentions that we have to move the agri-food sector towards a more carbon-friendly sector, whether with these best intention we are currently creating a system that is fragmented and that may make it more and more difficult to trade with each other within countries, or very much across countries. This is a real concern. I've been speaking to a minister who told me, my country is green, we label our country as green, but I don't know how to label my products as carbon friendly. This is a problem. I've been speaking to senior officials I mentioned who told me my farmers don't know which tool to use. I've been speaking to CEOs who tell me I lead a multinational, I'm reporting my carbon footprint, but I know that my competitor is also reporting his carbon footprint, but is using a different methodology. I'm afraid that next year I have accountants coming and telling me, asking me the question, why are you doing things differently than your competitor? So there are real questions around there. And that's why we at the OECD have started to discuss with our counterparts what is necessary in order to move away from fragmentation towards more collaboration. We have notably discussed the issue that I presented to you today. We have discussed it in April at our Global Forum for Agriculture with our policy representatives. We have been moving into more detail, speaking with supply chain experts in our food chain analysis network, looking at the same aspect and trying to find solutions that move us towards more collaboration away from fragmentation. We also need the perspective of agricultural economics here. This is the one before last slide. So the last slide about why you as a community may want to move rapidly is still coming. Many questions. How would these trends affect agricultural trade flows? How would these trends affect producers in low and middle income countries? Tom, you have been talking about challenges in Africa. This could potentially become a new challenge. How would these trends affect the organization of value chains and value sharing? What is the optimal institutional setup? We have also just heard how difficult it is to create strong institutions, and the institutions around this area still have to be created. How will consumers react in response to environmental labeling? And I can tell you there are some studies that say consumers want it, but they don't pay a higher price if the label is on, if there is a good CO2 performance. Will farmers therefore even receive a price premium if there is a better footprint? And what is the scope of harmonization or mutual recognition? Will these new outcome-based approaches of labeling, of measuring, will they substitute or complement the already existing standards? And what can we learn more generally from the existing literature on standards? Many, many questions there for the agricultural economists. Now, here the last slide. When we searched the literature for these terms, environmental impact, food and agriculture, life cycle assessment, we found many studies in environmental science journals. We came up with 503 for this particular period we searched for. In the same period, we found 2 articles in the economics literature. So many of these questions I've just asked you, they are probably still unanswered, and therefore we look forward to continue talking to you here, to this audience, to continue working with you on this area that is developing in a fast and furious way, and we look forward to scale up with you the speed of work in agricultural economists in this field. Thank you very much. I look forward to the questions.